Good afternoon, everyone. It's just gone 4 o'clock and I think we will make a start. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's presentation. My name is Jennifer Phillip and I'm the Chair of Palliative Medicine at the University of Melbourne, St Vincent's Hospital, and in collaboration with the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre. And I'm very proud to be hosting this event on behalf of the Palliative Nexus Research Group. I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, or which we're hosting this event today. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I wish to acknowledge the elders past and present, and also to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be in the audience today. This event, as I said, is being hosted by Palliative Nexus, which is a research group whose goal is that all people with advanced illness receive high quality palliative care that is equitable, timely and delivered as a standard of care and underpinned by high quality evidence. And the Palliative Nexus group has been excited to establish this event and to host it over the past really more than 2 years now. And I sort of have a wry smile when I say more than 2 years, because we conceived of this when we first went into lockdown back in Melbourne in 2020, and we thought, what's a good way of all staying connected and keeping up to date and keeping our professional development going, but also learning together as a field. And so we launched this Palspective series. And today I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Professor Suresh Sundaram. Suresh is the chair and head of the Department of Psychiatry, School of Clinical Sciences at Monash University. He's director of research for the mental health program at Monash, and he's also the clinical director of Cabrini Outreach Melbourne. For more than 2 decades, he's been involved in asylum seeker mental health. He's been an expert consultant on asylum seeker and refugee mental health to the UNHCR and has advised the United Nations Human Rights Council, Australian Human Rights Commission, along with national governments, including the Australian government, the US government, Canadian, New Zealand, Nauruan, and also PNG governments, as well as NGOs. He established pro bono health and mental health services for asylum seekers, most recently with the Cabrini Asylum Seeker and Refugee Health Hub, providing primary care and specialist mental health services in the state of Victoria. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome Suresh, whose talk today is entitled The Health and Moral Landscape of Detaining Asylum Seekers in Australia. Thank you, Suresh.
Thanks, Jen, for that kind introduction and the invitation to speak to all of you today. I will preface this talk by saying that I'm not going to mention the word palliative care once, or that phrase once, in this talk. So if you've tuned in accidentally, then please feel free to disconnect now. What instead I'm going to talk to you about is the health, and in particular the mental health implications of the detention of asylum seekers in Australia, and the impacts that I think that this has both on asylum seekers, obviously, and their families, but also on the community and society more generally. As Jen's mentioned, I've received funding and been served as an expert consultant to a number of agencies and organisations and governments, none of which have influenced the contents of what I'm about to tell you. What I will discuss over time, over the course of this presentation, is that firstly I'll present a context, both global and Australian, for refugees and asylum seekers. In particular, the policy context. I'll spend a bit more time talking about the focus of this talk, which is an offshore regional processing. I'll then describe in some detail the mental health impacts, and although I can and will discuss physical health issues, it is overwhelmingly the mental health impacts which are universal and most severe on these cohorts. I then want to spend the last little while talking about the policy implications, both nationally for Australia, but also globally, and I think that has significant is a significant issue for us. and then also the impacts on society and the Australian community. So the current refugee situation is as worse as it's ever been in the history of humanity. A UNHCR estimate recently has said that in about March of this year, there were more than 100 million displaced persons globally. This constituted 27 million refugees, which is, as you would know, greater than the population of Australia. In addition to that, there are another 4.5 million asylum seekers waiting to be assessed, to be determined to be refugees. And then we have in the order of about 60 million internally displaced persons and about another 10 million stateless people. The source countries for the global refugee burden is, as you might predict, countries that have made the news in terms of conflict. Syria, the Ukraine, which has been very recent, as you would all know, and now is the second largest source country for refugees in the world. Afghanistan, which the Taliban took over towards the end of last year, has again increased the number of refugees that has contributed to the world. And then other countries which might be less visible, such as South Sudan, and then again Myanmar, where in fact large numbers of Rohingyas have had to flee the country. Important to note, and I'll come back to this issue repeatedly, that 42% of displaced persons in the world are children. And then where do these refugees and asylum seekers and forcibly displaced persons go? They don't go to Australia or to Europe or to North America. They go to countries which are adjacent to the source countries. So countries such as Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda. I'll make mention, of course, that the Ukrainians have been able to flee to Europe and in particular to Poland, where currently Poland is hosting more than 3 million Ukrainian refugees. And I'll also make special mention of Germany, who under their previous Chancellor, Angela Merkel, were extraordinarily generous compared to the rest of the Western industrialized world in taking very large numbers of Syrian and Iraqi and also Afghani refugees at a time of incredible need during the heightened conflicts in those countries. Overall, about 85% of the world's refugees are hosted in the developing world. The next line on the slide, which you can see, gives you the relative proportion. So what this is saying is that Lebanon is hosting 156 refugees per 1,000 head of population. Jordan is hosting about 72 refugees per 1,000 head of population. But if you go to the high-income countries, we are hosting about 2.7 per 1,000 head of population. So that's per capita. If Australia, for example, was to host the same ratio as a country such as Lebanon, it would be comparable to the population of Melbourne that we would need to be hosting. The next line on this slide is potentially paints this in an even more dramatic way. This is an arbitrary figure. It doesn't have any specific unit, but what it does is it ranks countries according to the cost burden that they are carrying of refugees that are within their country. And so the first country on this list, and I will add that this was a figure that UNHCR published annually until 2014, and after 2014, a number of developed rich countries deemed it inappropriate for UNHCR to publish this number, so I've only got 2014 data. Democratic Republic of Congo was the first, 471, Ethiopia 453. The first Western industrialized nation on that list comes in at number 34, and that's Russia, with a value of 9. Australia, of 2014 data, has a value of 1. which means that the Democratic Republic of Congo carries 470 times the global refugee burden that Australia carries. Recent data, and this is 2019-2020 data, that's the most recent data that's been available. UNHCR settled 92,400 refugees in 25 countries. These were the numbers. I'm not quite sure what happened there. I'll go back. Not quite sure what happened. That 92,400 were settled in 25 countries that accepted refugees, and Australia at that time accepted 12,500. I think it's important to note that the number that UNHCR resettled, that 100,000 or just under 100,000, is about half of what it usually would attempt to resettle. And I think this year it's attempting to resettle about 200,000. The reason that was halved was because the United States had reduced its refugee intake from about the high 80s down to 0 under the last year of the previous president of the United States government, and that's the reason why that number is reduced. It would also be important to specify that even with an intake of 200,000, it would be in the order of about 135 years before the Western world were able to resettle all the refugees that needed resettlement. So what's the Australian context for this? Australia has, and it's important to listen to the language, Australia has a ceiling of 13,750 places that it offers to refugees globally. The ceiling means that it has no compunction to fill those places, and in fact hasn't been able to fill those places in the last few years because of the COVID pandemic. In addition to those, over the last 6 years or so, it's offered an additional 12,000 places to Syrians and Iraqis. And in particular, that was in response to that horrific photograph of that 3-year-old boy that was washed up on a beach in the Mediterranean and picked up by a Turkish soldier, which prompted the then Prime Minister to offer these places. And then more recently, following the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, the previous Australian government offered 16,500 Afghani places over 4 years. So that's 4,125 places. The current government has not revised that quota of 13,750, although there's been strong advocacy to say that that number could easily be doubled as a starting point, and would then bring it back into line with countries that have been much more generous, such as Canada. In addition to those places, there are, and this causes considerable concern, an additional 31,000, and in fact that number was around 40,000 unauthorised arrivals in Australia. These people have, generally speaking, arrived by boat, and so therefore have been deemed boat people. And these people are then seeking asylum in Australia through the onshore humanitarian program. So they arrive without a valid visa. They then apply to the Australian Department of Immigration to be assessed as to whether or not they're refugees, and if they are, then they can be potentially offered a refugee resettlement place. Australia offers about 1,000 to 2,000 places to this cohort per annum. So again, if you look at those numbers, that's going to be between 15 to 30 years before these people are settled. In addition to that, people who arrive on a valid visa by aeroplane can also apply for asylum, and these people can vary again in numbers. The Refugee Council of Australia estimates that this number is around about 25,000, but it can be hard to get accurate figures. Of that 31,000 people that I mentioned before, those who arrived by boat, between the years of 2012 and really up until now, anybody who arrives by boat can be subjected, and can be is important here, can be subjected to transfer to offshore regional processing centres. There were two that were established in 2012. These were on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and in Nauru. There have been, over the course of the last 8 years, 9 years, approximately 4,100 people who've been transferred for processing in these centres. And currently, we believe there are about 230 who are still offshore. These people have been made or have been treated as exceptional cases, although there's nothing in their history which suggests that they are. But as a consequence of having been moved to these offshore places, these people can only ever receive temporary protection in Australia, and they will never be allowed to reside in Australia. So current government policy, both previous government and current government, is that these people, even though they may receive healthcare, for example, in Australia, will never be allowed to live here. Now, immigration detention is a peculiarly Australian phenomenon in the way that it has been constructed in this country, although many countries practice various forms of immigration detention, and I'll come to that in a moment. The first and maybe the most interesting element of immigration detention in Australia is that its characteristic is indefinite detention. In other words, somebody who is placed in immigration detention can be kept in immigration detention for as long as the minister deems it to be the case. This was initially thought to breach human rights and was taken to the High Court. However, the High Court held that in fact the minister has the authority to hold somebody indefinitely. This applies in particular to these unauthorised maritime arrivals that I've described previously. The practice was introduced in 1992, and for those of you with a long political memory will remember that the Prime Minister at that time was Paul Keating. And intriguingly, you might also remember that the Minister for Immigration who introduced this practice was in fact a member of the socialist left of all factions within the Labor Party, and in fact of all political factions in Australia, Minister Jerry Hand. The immigration detention that was introduced at that time was placed in places that were, to put it mildly, remote and inhospitable. I've got a picture down there of the detention centre in Woomera. There were comparable detention centres in Curtin, which is about 50 to 60 kilometres inland from Derby in northwestern Western Australia. And then there have been other detention centres in equally remote places. There's a reason for that, and I'll come to that in a moment. It was noted that in 1991 that these detention centres were being significantly overcrowded because of the increase in the number of unauthorised maritime arrivals. And in 2001, there was a new development that was formulated by Prime Minister Howard and his government, where they created two offshore regional processing centres in Nauru and in Manus Island. So the first time that this happened, it operated between 2001 and 2007. The centres were then closed in 2007 and then reopened again in 2012. The closure and the reopening of those centres was done by the Labor governments of those times under Prime Minister Rudd, who closed them and then reopened them. And then, of course, they were expanded, consolidated by the subsequent governments, which were principally Liberal governments. It's important to note that although the Papua New Guinea, the use of Papua New Guinea as an offshore regional processing country has ceased, Nauru continues to operate. Now, I think it's important for people who may not be familiar with these two centres to be aware of where they were and where they are, and about the sorts of conditions that people have been enduring now for 10 years. In the top left-hand part of the graph, of the slide, this is the island of Nauru, which has, as you might expect, 10,000 lovely Nauruans who live on Nauru. Nauru could fit within the perimeter of Tullamarine Airport here in Melbourne. It's about 25 square kilometres. Manus Island, which you can see on the map here, is the northernmost or the most remote region within Papua New Guinea. This is it here as a map. And the pictures below are pictures of the detention centres and the facilities that were provided for detainees. This is an important picture because you can see here that in fact it's a locked centre and that ingress and egress from these centres is highly controlled. The reason that this has all been done is, in essence, to ensure that maximum security and least public visibility can be able to be obtained. It's not possible for journalists or the media to visit these places, and it's certainly not possible for the transmission of information from these places. That makes the three papers that I've got here, or the three documents that I've put on this slide, important, because these were really the only public documents that were able to emerge from the time that the centres operated at full capacity. In particular, the UNHCR document, which is on the left-hand side of the slide here, was a report that UNHCR commissioned me to write about the health and in particular the mental health status of people that were detained on Manus Island in 2016. The outcomes from this report were of such importance to UNHCR that they read the entire transcript of the report into Hansard, so it became publicly available, and hence we were able to then publish this in the Lancet the subsequent year. And the middle paper here is a paper that we did on people who had been detained in Nauru and then had been transferred to Australia for their health care. The reason that UNHCR were so taken aback by the findings of the report that we did on Manus Island was because of the prevalence of psychiatric disorder in the sample that we were able to survey. We surveyed about 20% of the 900 detainees, and we found rates of post-traumatic stress disorder just under 80%, a depressive or anxiety disorder just under 88%, and either one or both disorders of about 93%. This is amongst the highest in the recorded literature or the published literature. Rowan Borshman, who's an academic at Melbourne University, and his team were also able to access publicly available data. So this was data that was published by the Australian Border Force and the Department of Immigration and the Department of Home Affairs. They were able to calculate that in detention, self-harm rates were 200 times that of the mainstream Australian population. And in Nauru, that was about 260 cases of self-harm per 1,000 detained asylum seekers. In addition to that, there is data that indicates that there have been 9 suicides in detention, and these include self-immolations, which have obviously attracted some significant publicity. So from this, what are the impacts on people? This is the qualitative study data that I mentioned before of people who've been detained on Nauru and then been transferred to Australia for health care. This is a quote: "In my country, they torture your body, but in Australia, they kill your mind." And the sorts of experiences that people reported were of disempowerment, violation, loss of self-agency, helplessness, resentment, frustration, anger, rage, sadness, despair, desperation, despondency, disengagement. People felt irreparably damaged with a deep sense of trauma and loss from the violation, deep sense of loss from the violation and trauma and from the wasted years. There were very high rates of reports, and of course these are anecdotal reports, unverified, of sexual assault, including rape, and including rape of children, which the former detainees reported to us, which of course resulted in very significant traumatic memories in addition to other traumatic memories from the experiences that they had undergone on Nauru. This is another quote: "If you don't want to give me a life, okay, kill me and shoot me and I will die one time. Why are you killing my brain? Why are you cutting my heart every single day? When somebody uses a knife and you die, and when somebody kills you every single day, they kill your brain and your mind. It's totally different. It's better you die one time." The other element, and I'll come to this again towards the end of my talk, is about the betrayal that people experience. And this was a betrayal of institutions such as the Australian government, but also a betrayal of what they believed that they were entitled to, of what their self-worth and their concept of who they were as a human were betrayed by the way that they were treated in these detention centres. The other experience was one of being excluded, of not being accorded the value of being a human, of being rejected. There was a very good quote that I don't have here, but of somebody who thought that they were being treated like a pet dog, or being treated worse than dogs, or like a dog in Nauru, until they came to Australia and saw the way that we treated our pets here, and realised that in fact they were being treated worse than the way that we treat pets here. So current factors, and this is important, is that under current policy, the detention can be protracted and indefinite, and there's a complete uncertainty as to how long you'll be kept in detention. As I said, people in detention now for 9 to 10 years. The fear of refoulement, and that means being returned to the country from which you fled, which of course is in violation of the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, unless you agree to it. And of course, people, if they've been detained for 10 years without seeing their family or their children, might well agree under those sorts of circumstances to be refouled. People who are living in the community can, at any point in time, at the minister's discretion, be returned to locked detention. Family separation, so no one is allowed to reunify with their family. So we have many patients whose spouse, whose wife may well have been pregnant at the time that they fled, who've never seen their child. Many people who last saw their children when their children were preschoolers, who are now graduating from high school or finishing high school. So that length of family separation. People who are here have no right to work. They are unemployed. Many of them have lost their previous work skills because of the protracted time in detention where you weren't permitted to do anything. People are not allowed to engage in any education or vocational training. This has been particularly hard for children who finished secondary school, and now, having finished secondary school, successfully finished secondary school, are unable to undertake any education as such. There's no English language classes, there's no attempt at cultural familiarisation or offers of courses or supported activities to familiarise people with culture in mainstream society. And people who are in community detention have their accommodation specified as their schooling is. They have restricted freedom of movement with curfews, and they have a living allowance which they're given, but that's relatively minimal. So the sorts of problems we see in adults, as you might predict, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression. I've mentioned the suicidality, which has been driven by a desperation and despair. There is a decay and crumbling of hope, and this is very important now. So this is now 9 to 10 years down the track. Marriages which were very strong, relationships which were very strong, have begun to fray and fragment. We've begun to see the emergence of family violence, which is very, very traumatic. People essentially don't care any longer about their health, and in fact don't really care about anything concerning themselves. Many of them have lost their faith. Some of these people, as these conditions deteriorate, can develop a paranoid persecutory psychosis, which has become more prominent in these populations over time. which can be quite scary, both for the individual, but also for family members and for clinicians who might interact with these people. And I've mentioned already this irreparable loss of functioning and in particular of skills, which is tragic because, of course, many of these people will not be able to regain their pre-morbid level of functioning. I also want to mention the intergenerational transmission of trauma. So parents in these detention centres, which were fundamentally prison-like in their nature, were not able in any way to exercise autonomy over themselves or over their family, and so therefore weren't able to parent adequately their children, and so their children were then exposed to, as I've mentioned before, significant violations by staff, but also the parental mental illness and the impacts that that has had on children has been quite profound. The sorts of impacts we see in children include anxiety, which is undoubtedly the major feature of how children have responded to this protracted detention. We've seen major depressive and post-traumatic stress disorders in kids, which manifests in multiple ways, such as separation anxiety, school refusal, enuresis and encopresis, disrupted sleep and nightmares, night terrors. I've mentioned the disrupted attachment because of the significant parental mental illness, but also the conditions of detention, which have essentially de-parentified the parenting skills that parents might have had. And this has resulted in things such as oppositional behaviour and attentional difficulties, and a preferred strategy that children use to cope with the anxiety, which is screen-based numbing. We've seen children, as a consequence of this, have learning delays, especially expressive language delay, and not all of that has returned, unfortunately, even in supportive environments. We've seen, as I've described to you before, suicidal ideation intent. The youngest child that attempted suicide that I'm aware of was 9 years old. And this became increasingly prevalent throughout the time in Nauru, in particular through food and fluid refusal. And that, of course, prompted that public action, which resulted in children being transferred to Australia with their families. And I've mentioned the despair that adolescents have been experiencing because they have, in good faith, finished school, but then not been permitted to undertake any tertiary or vocational training. So in the last few minutes, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the policy implications. So Australia has uniquely developed these policy settings, but because of the perceived so-called success of these policy settings, they have now been emulated in a number of countries. I've listed Hungary and Denmark there, but the United Kingdom has taken the next step of trying to now establish offshore regional processing, which it did in Rwanda, and was about to send a plane load of asylum seekers to Rwanda for offshore regional processing, but a bid or an application to the UK Court of Human Rights prevented that from happening, but that's now before the court and is being litigated. The other components which Australia has implemented, but which have, I think, probably been more effective in stopping unauthorised maritime arrivals have been things such as boat towbacks, but probably even more important has been the enhanced point of origin surveillance. Now, what I mean by that is that Australia has invested heavily in Indonesian and Malaysian authorities, and also now Sri Lankan authorities, in preventing boats from leaving those countries and in ensuring that boats that leave those countries are intercepted early and taken back to those countries for processing. The last point that I want to make about policy implications, and this I want to pick up in a moment, is the creation of a class that is not accorded the same status as us. That is, that these people are treated as an other, they're treated as an alien because they're not afforded the same rights and privileges that a citizen or a permanent resident of Australia is afforded. This, I think, has very important social impacts. The first is that by othering refugees and asylum seekers, we can remove them from sight. This has been through the use of remote detention centres in the way that I've described. There are a whole set of other policy settings that have emerged. One is obviously minimising communication with the outside world, removing media contact, and placing them outside the mainstream legal frameworks, but also internal policies. So, for example, such as referring to people by number rather than by name, I think has been very effective in dehumanising them from public view. I think through this alienation, it becomes possible for some of the injustices that I've described to become ultimately permissible. And although I've used the extreme notion here of the sexual violations that some of the people who were detained on Nauru experienced, others have included the ongoing detention of people in prison-like conditions. And I think by prohibiting social inclusion, these people's humanity can be reduced, and they no longer need to be accorded the same moral value as an included member of our society. And ultimately, this blurring between nation-state identity, that is, you're defined as a person because you're Australian, and human identity occurs. And although there is no need to transcend this nation-state identity with any overarching concept of humanity, it's a sort of concept that Hannah Arendt introduced a number of years ago to describe, or 50 years ago more, to describe the situation of the refugee from a Jewish perspective. And I think now is also being very much observed in what we're seeing today in Australia. So to conclude, I think national policies focused on the deterring of asylum seekers, which are based on principles of inclusion through the use of indefinite mandatory detention, offshore processing, and the prohibition of resettlement, have profound impacts. Well, obviously on the affected individuals, but I think also on the host community. The individual impacts are devastating, such as the mental disorders and psychological harm and corrosion of personal moral structures, and the impacts on society which degrade human rights and consciously allow nation-state identity to replace humanity as the core defining notion of the individual. So I'd just like to acknowledge the asylum seekers and their families who contributed to the research that I've presented today, the Cabrini Asylum Seeker and Refugee Health Hub, where I've done much of this work, and one of my close and long-term postdoctoral collaborators, Dr. Debbie Hocking. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Suresh. Thank you very much. Gosh, thank you for such a clear and comprehensive review of what has and is occurring on our watch in our time. Maybe I might, thank you. We have some time for questions, which I'd ask the audience mates to put in, perhaps in the Q&A forum. This is obviously deeply disturbing and extremely challenging. I wonder if I could start off by asking you about the data which you presented, which showed the high rates of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you have data or information about whether that worsens? It's hard to see it worsening, but whether detention itself has an impact over time? Do you have some longitudinal information?
So we actually don't have a lot of longitudinal data. There have been a couple of papers, again, from an Australian perspective, and in particular, the work of a psychiatrist, Peter Young, who was in fact the director of the mental health program that provided mental health services to people in detention. And he turned whistleblower and published a couple of papers, which in fact shows that over the course of 18 months, the mental health of people deteriorates very significantly. The only point that I would make is that data. Obviously, once he left, he wasn't able to collect that data anymore. But of course, now we're seeing people 9 years and 10 years down the track in terms of detention. So we assume that that's going to be much worse than that. We don't have the data to support that.
Thanks, Suresh. The other question I was hoping to ask is you talked of the kids and them sort of becoming adolescents, but there is this sort of extraordinary prospect of, you know, someone growing old in detention. Is that, I wonder even what that could begin to look like. I'm not sure that's a question or a comment, but do you have any thoughts on, can people recover from this, I wonder?
So two questions there. The question of recovery, I think, is very problematic. We're at the moment undertaking a survey of people who've been in detention, who've been released, and we hope to be able to get some funding to conduct that prospectively. We have previously looked at a cohort of people who've never been in detention and who were asylum seekers and lived in the community. Now, interestingly, with that study, we found that people who lived in the community, who were able to access Medicare, who were able to access work rights, even though they may not have had a job, actually improved considerably in the community. So we know that there are simple social interventions which can improve mental health, but we don't know what the impacts of living in the community are on people who've been detained, and that in fact they will improve. A very small amount of anecdotal data based on the cohort that were detained between 2001 and 2007 would indicate in fact that people don't fully recover, and in fact a good proportion of those people don't recover at all and continue to remain highly disabled.
So there's two the thoughts on that is, you know, it's an extraordinarily, you know, ghastly thought, but even from a health economic point of view, there'd be so many reasons to treat people, you know, and cheap ways of improving the outcomes, both immediately and long term. Aileen Crowe has just sort of queried, can people in community detention actually access Medicare, or are they only able to rely on OHMS?
So, in fact, in community detention, if you're placed in community detention, you are provided health care as part of the community detention package by the private healthcare contractor, which is IHMS. I think that's a typo, Aileen. So it's IHMS. And IHMS can contract services within the community to provide that healthcare. The really big challenge has been that, and many of you may know, there was the Medivac legislation from a couple of years ago, which enabled a proportion of people to be transferred to Australia for healthcare. We've been trying to access those people and survey their health status, and in fact, the people that we found invariably didn't have those health issues addressed. So I think that remains a very problematic issue because the services that they are provided are determined by the private healthcare provider. They're not determined by either the person or by, if you like, an independent healthcare practitioner.
Thank you. There's a comment from Brian Lee. Thank you for your sobering and frightening talk. The comment being, what do you think is it about that's made us so blind to the distress of other humans? Is it the government's been so successful in dehumanising people as numbers and that they are called so-called illegal, or is it that the government is reflecting wider societal values? We just don't care about people that we don't know personally and are invisible.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I think it's both. So I think that there's been a very effective strategy and set of policy directions that have excluded people from mainstream society, and that's included numbering people. It's been putting them in remote offshore places where they can't be seen. It's been doing activities that ensure that there's no media contact or media engagement with them. And at the same time, describing these people as undesirable, unwanted, illegals, queue jumpers, people have been described as being murderers or other sorts of criminals. All of these sorts of activities undertaken by government serve to devalue the worth of these people, and I think that's been an effective strategy to turn the Australian population off to their suffering. And I contrast that with the way that the Biloela community, for example, have responded to the family of Tamil asylum seekers, and the response there as a very important contrast.
I might, thank you, take sort of the last question and just combine a couple. Is that people have commented about how distressing it is to see the data and to hear or be reminded of this, and what can an individual, or what can a person with no political clout but feeling the need to do something, what can they do to help raise an awareness and support refugees?
Yeah, so there are a number of organisations that provide pro bono healthcare to asylum seekers in the community. One of them that I mentioned before, the one that I helped establish, is the Community Asylum Seeker and Refugee Health Hub. There's also the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne. There is asylum seeker centres in other capital cities, in particular Sydney and Brisbane, as being the two other sort of major source or destinations for asylum seekers. So I think that's, if people have got skills that they can contribute and wishing to, that would be very valuable. However, I think also the even more valuable contribution is the sort of public activity that we've seen at a number of different times. So the Biloela community and their response to the family there, but also the widespread public response in Australia when vision and data concerning the children in Nauru, who, as I said, were self-harming, were food and fluid refusing, which resulted in a concerted action, a public action to get their transfer to Australia, because the politicians at that time really believed that there was a wave or a crescendo of Australian public outrage at the way that we were treating children. So I think those sorts of things are very important, and I think it's also very important that there are lots of informal networks and groups in Australia of concerned Australians who wish to support and express their support towards refugees, and I think those organisations have done a magnificent job in keeping this issue in the public light.
Thanks, Suresh. There are some more questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. I can't thank you. It comes to me to thank you for your talk and for raising our awareness and for giving your time to us today, but also the extraordinary amount of time that you've put into doing the humane thing that our world hasn't been doing. And we really appreciate those efforts. And we also thank you for your very clear and comprehensive talk today. There's lots of chats and some curious hands and things going up on the side. So thank you. That's really wonderful. Also, to finish off, can I also thank the people behind the scenes, Anna Collins, Stacey Panozzo, and particularly Tanya Fraser, who makes all of this happen. I'm really grateful for all your coordination and holding of this event, Tanya. Can I thank the audience for coming and for the questions and the discussion, and for also your loyalty to these sessions. It's been really good, and I'm really delighted that we're continuing them after 2 years and a bit of lockdown and a bit of back and forth with the working from home. Our next event is on the 7th of September, Wednesday the 7th of September, and we have Professor Liz Lobb, who's going to be talking to us about some of the outcomes from the bereavement in COVID study that she's been leading. So thank you everyone once again, and good afternoon.